Third time.
Third, okay. So what basically happens is this. Most of the meditation, or let us say most of the retreats, are meditation retreats. And that they teach meditation, and along with that, they teach a little bit of Dhamma. But
Yes.
that the main teaching of the Buddha is not teaching of meditation. The main teaching of the Buddha is Dhamma. And part of the reason that that was true in the time of the Buddha was because most of the students that had come to him, either early in his teaching career or even later, they came already being able to do jhana meditation. That it was almost assumed. And yet nowadays, they don't have that. And so what you could call it is that meditation is basically preschool. Is for preschoolers. That the real school is the school of Dhamma. But that the students are, let us say, in modern times, the students are encouraged strongly to do meditation, mostly because the mind that's untrained is unfit for work. So we have to do some mental training. Now, one of the things that did happen is that during your time of education, there was a certain amount of mental training. But we need to get the mind really fit for work. And one of the easy ways for students to understand this is with the quality of being able to read a book or to read the screen. Because you were taught how to read when you were 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 years old. But mostly when people read, they'll start to read something that looks a little bit of interesting, and while they're reading, they'll try to put things together, put it into their map, and then they'll start thinking about what it is that they're reading. By the time they get to the bottom of the second paragraph, all that's happening is that their eyes is following along the words, and they're not picking up anything because the mind is thinking about whatever it was beginning to think about, all on its own. Now, that's not real reading, but that happens. Does it ever happen to you? Do you
All
catch
the time.
yourself at the end of a page, right, recognizing that you're not actually reading what you intended to read, and you're
Yeah.
saying it happens often?
Yeah.
It
Absolutely.
doesn't happen all the time because sometimes you're actually able to read, and at other times you're not reading.
Yeah.
But it happens frequently. All right. With meditation, what we're actually going to do is to train the mind to stay fixed and focused so that you can apply it, for instance, on a book and keep it on the book because that's your intention. And that takes a mental training that even when you were taught how to read, you weren't even taught how to read in the sense of how to focus and pay attention with the mind so that you could read
Mm.
rather than reading a little bit and then thinking about it and then reading a little bit more and thinking about it. To actually be able to read and
If
absorb.
you if that you sort of don't pause it, do you still is it still easy to comprehend what you're reading, or do you maybe have to pause to process certain parts of it?
Um, if that's actually happening and it's happening consciously, then that's excellent. Most people will start to contemplate while letting the eyes continue on, meaning that they're not really getting both of them. But if you stop and figure out what you've just read so that you absorb it and get it, then when you start to read on, you're actually able to absorb and get that too because you're paying attention.
Yeah.
That in fact, that's possibly one of the primary things that's said to students in a classroom by a teacher is to pay attention. Actually, many of the suttas that the Buddha says, I'm about to teach on this, if that's okay with you guys. And they say, yes, please teach us. And he says, okay, pay attention. Listen closely and wisely to what I'm about to say. Maybe I should start saying that to the students also. So, this is what meditation is. It's the development of the mind to get it to the point of a skill so that you can pay attention, pay wise attention. And that this state of mind is unusual. It's rare, but almost everybody can be in this state for short periods of time. The skill is to develop it over time. All right. Bhikkhu Buddhadasa calls this state of mind a mind fit for work. In the suttas, it is referred to as a mind free from hindrances, and the joy and the pleasure of being free from the hindrances, and it has the quality of having applied and sustained thought. All right, and it also generally, because of that pleasure, has the quality of manufacturing that pleasure. So that state of mind then is normally, or let us say at least in one sutta, is referred to as a bathsman with bath powder. Now my remembrance is that my grandmother made biscuits. She made them often, almost daily. And that when I hear the story of the bath powder man, I actually see my grandmother doing exactly the same thing with the flour that she's working with that the bathman does with his powder, and that is that they lay it out on the table, and then they dip their fingers in water and then start to sprinkle water on it. And then they start to pat it in so that eventually no amount of that flour has no water in it, and that everything is moist, and yet it's not dripping and oozing with water. That is just the right point of having just the right amount of water in it. Okay? So what we can do with that story is look at the drops of water that's being put on is actually pleasure, joy. And the joy is the joy of throwing the hindrances out of the mind. That is actually the way that I speak about it to students is actually implied right there in the sutta, to take joy in throwing the hindrances out. Take that pleasure. To throw that stuff out of the mind and then put into the mind what we want to put into the mind. And we're going to bring it in joyfully. So we're sprinkling the mind then with joy, so that it's no longer dry, no longer dusty, no longer subject to the wind coming in and blowing it away. It's got just enough joy so that it's contained as a solid item. It unifies the mind. The powdered mind is scattered all over the place, but with joy it becomes unified. So this is a way of looking at it, all right? Now, this state of mind that I'm talking about, the Buddha, first off, the Buddha calls this state, it has a label to it, But the label is there only when all of these ingredients are there, which I've just discussed with you. The mind is free from hindrance, the mind that has joy, the mind that has the pleasure of being free from the hindrances, and it has the ability to apply itself and sustain as if you were able to read a book,
Mm.
line after line, page after page, and know that you've got the end of it and know that you understand while you're listening. That's actually the state that I expect students to be in when they're listening to me. That's why I rub my hands around and do things like that to keep your attention. And throw some joy in there from time to time, too. So, this state was before the time of the Buddha, and since then, that's first jhana.
Mm.
That is the state of jhana. And that we can get into that state of jhana by having the ability to remember sati, to come back over and over and over again. So we start to train the mind so that it'll stay put and stay focused so that we can cover any particular piece of information. So in that regard, you would say that, well, that's what physicists can do. And I say, yes, that's why I like physicists as Dhamma students.
Mm.
I like mathematicians as Dhamma students. I like martial artists as Dhamma students because they have the ability to be here now, because if they're thinking about something else so far away, they'll get punched in the face.
Mm.
And
Yeah.
so, and musicians also, because musicians have had to go through a training of the mind. These are the kind of people that make really good Dhamma students. The kind of student who doesn't make a good Dhamma student is the one who already thinks he has all the answers. Someone who has been indoctrinated into a religion, for
Mm-hmm.
instance, or into a particular way of thinking. Because what we're going to do in this state of mind is to systematically take everything apart. We're going to take the world apart. We're going to take the self apart. We're going to take the mind apart. We're going to take it all down to all of the various pieces. In fact, in one place, in a conversation between a king and I think Melinda and Nagarjuna, that they met out on the road and the king was in his chariot. And so, with permission, Nagarjuna had the charioteers take the chariot apart completely. They took first the basket off, then they took the ridgepole out, then they took the axle off, and then they took the wheels, and they took the wheels apart and took all of them all down to the smallest piece of wood. Put it all in the pile. And then Nagarjuna asked Melinda, "Where's your chariot?
Mm.
Where is the chariot?" That basically this is what happens with our mind is that we build things up from component parts, and then we lose track of the fact that there's all these component parts in there. But if you look at things correctly, for instance, a particular government like the United States government does not actually exist. What does exist is all of these constituent and component parts, but that no one will take a look at their view of those particular component parts. And their idea of the U.S. government is going to be completely different than someone else's idea of the United States government. Republican versus Democrat is your first one. But then you wind up with what? 20 million Democrats? No, 20 million Republicans, and they all have their own individual viewpoint. So there wound up being 20 million different Republican parties. And that's how it goes. And so the mind tries to generalize. And one of the big generalizations that is made is me, I,
Mm.
which is basically all of that stuff put together. But when we start taking all of those things apart, we recognize, hey, there's no I in here, just like there was no real chariot in that pile of lumber.
Mm.
And so this is basically what Buddhism or the teaching of the Buddha is all about. And in the process, we begin to recognize that there is a major relationship between this thing, this delusion that I have called me, and the fact that I suffer.
Mm.
And so that's the real teaching of the Buddha. He does not teach self and no self. He does not teach reincarnation or rebirth or any of those things. What he teaches is suffering and no suffering. And if we have our mind fit for work, when we hear about this, we can get it. But often what happens is that the students don't get it the first time because it doesn't go deep enough to actually dig out the stuff that we're talking about. So the students will come quite often the week after I've talked about something, and we've got to cover it again because now they're beginning to dig stuff up. Now they're beginning to see what's going on, so now we can begin to dig a little deeper or stir things up, get a whole shovelful so we can shovel it out.
Mm.
So this is the kind of way that we do it, and that this is actually the process then that the student needs to go through, and that the Buddha actually says in Sutta number 36 that it is in fact this first jhana is the path to enlightenment, not the higher jhanas. That the best that can be said for them is that once the students actually get the Dhamma really well, then they have plenty of time to piddle with and play with the jhanas. That the jhanas are the toys of the Buddha, but they were not the path to the Buddha. And in fact, the second, third, and fourth jhana have to do with specifically the very thing that got me to the point of wanting to tell you about this. So let's look at it like this. Let's go kind of deep down. Do you know what a B tree is?
No.
Or a directory structure?
Yeah.
On PC, you know, the directory structure.
Mm.
So what we're going to do is we're kind of going to go through the directory structure of the teachings of the Buddha, because we're going to go down to find a couple of files that are way down there buried, but we got to go through the structure of it first.
Yeah.
All right. So at the top of the C drive is suffering and no suffering. Immediately under that are the Four Noble Truths. So the first directory is going to be suffering. The second one is going to be the cause of suffering. The third one is going to be the relief or the joy or what it's like to be free from suffering. And that most students make a huge mistake at this point. And so let me make sure that you're not going to make it. When we talk about the third noble truth, they look at it as if, oh, eventually I may touch the third noble truth. And that's the wrong way to look at it. No, the right way to look at it is that, oh, this is the third noble truth to be practiced right here, right now, to start getting the benefits of it, to know what it is, to figure out what the difference is between the first noble truth and the third noble truth. You got to know. You got to figure it out. You got to experience it. With that joy is going to get you into that third noble truth. While we're in the third noble truth, we will eventually figure out what the path is going to be to finish, or how can we continue with this. But we also have to look at this second noble truth, which is the cause of suffering. And so let's open that door, that second noble truth. We're going to open the second noble truth directory, and in there what we're going to find are several major teachings. And at the top of the list are the that suffering is caused by moba loha dosa, which is ill will, greed, and ignorance. Now, greed is actually a very, very big thing. When people are greedy, that means their life is kind of driven by it. But each individual is really, really greedy only occasionally. But that everybody is greedy a little bit most of the time. So when we're using the word greed, we're not talking about a really, really big greed that everybody can see and sneer at. We're talking about the little stuff that we hide from even ourselves. The same thing is true with ill will. And the ignorance, if you see that as great big, it's basically what that means is delusion, in the sense that there's a difference between not knowing and know that you don't know versus not knowing but you think you know. And that this is where the word belief comes in. That humans are believing animals. They are willing to make connections between the dots to make a pattern, when in fact, in reality and in nature, there is no connection between the two. And so a lot of what we're going to teach or explore with the teaching of the Buddha is what's real and what's not real in this set of connections, and how we're storing inappropriate connections as part of our memory map, and how we can learn to stop that. Okay, so we've gotten down to the causes of suffering, moba loba dosa, which means greed, ill will, and delusion. But now there's some teachings that go under that would be a whole directory of their own. One of these would be the teaching of the five aggregates. Okay. Now, in the beginning of meditation, we were talking about anapanasati, and with anapanasati, we're talking about the four foundations of mindfulness, simply because that was the old way of looking at it. But if you think about it, when I mean old, I'm talking about in pre-Buddha days with earth, wind, fire, and water, the four primary elements, which are also basic old ways of doing meditation. Earth kasenas, water meditations, including crystals, fire meditation. They still have a lot of fire temples in India, and air meditations, which wind up with astronomy and astrology and meteorology. 2 out of 3 ain't bad, but so the four foundations of mindfulness then are broken down into the next level as to the five aggregates. And the five aggregates are still the body, the feeling, but now the mind and its mind's objects are broken down into a functionality as opposed to a structure. And the functionality is consciousness, perception, and sankhara. And we'll talk about sankhara a lot in just a minute.
Okay.
All right, so these are the five aggregates. The most important quality of the teaching of these five aggregates, which I will give you an entire talk on someday, is that there is no self anywhere in these five aggregates. The body contains no self. There's no magic molecule. There's no steam that's given off. That there is no self in the feelings. There's also no self in consciousness, and that this is the one where most of the Hindus think that the self is reincarnated, that it's consciousness that's reincarnated. But the Buddha is very explicit that, oh no, consciousness is dependently arisen. It happens because of causes and conditions. For instance, eyeballs. You got to have eyes to see. It's like having a, let us say, an old-timey tape recorder that does not have a camera attached to it, cannot do video. That's just how it is. All right? That you have to have eyes to see. Eye consciousness then means that it's dependent upon having eyes. And it also is depending upon having enough light so that you can see an object. This is consciousness. Consciousness is there and it's not there. You go to sleep at night and consciousness is gone. You pay attention to one thing and you miss out on something else because you're not paying attention to it. So consciousness is actually dependently arisen, and that is known by the sense that it's associated with. Like fire is known by its fuel, house fires, car fires, gas fires, log fires, dog fires, gasoline fires. So consciousness is known by eye consciousness, ear consciousness, touch consciousness, nose consciousness, and tongue consciousness associated with the sense organs. The same thing is also true about perception, except that I don't want to spend much time on perception right now. I want to get to Sankara because that's an important point. And that is, perception is the processing of taking all of your old stored past memories, thoughts, feelings, vocabulary, etc. And the perception takes all of that like a processor on a computer off of the hard drive and then does an analysis of what the sense is doing. So the sense happens, then we perceive it, so that we begin to understand what it actually is based upon our old past. Okay? That internal processing is called perception, and the actual process itself can then be called an internal representation of the sense. It might be the ability to remember a song, etc., like that. All right? So that's what is called the salayatana in Pali. But by telling you that word, what that means is that I've actually come out of the directory of the five aggregates and gone into the next directory called Paticca Samuppada, which is the actual way that the mind works. But we already have to look at the way that the mind works a little bit in order to talk about the five aggregates. So now you can see how this stuff is layered from the second noble truth to the big ones, down to the five aggregates, down to Paticca Samuppada. But on Paticca Samuppada, that's where the word Sankara really is completely and well defined. And if you can understand Sankara, then you can begin to understand how the mind works completely. The Sankara, there are three kinds of Sankara. There is a bodily Sankara, there is a verbal Sankara, and there is an emotional Sankara, which basically means this is the way we have been storing things in the past. This is our memory systems. We store things in the body, deformities, the ability to hear better than others, and all kinds of things. Many of these bodily Sankaras are actually skills, like music or sports or martial arts. Many things like that are actually stored right into the body as bodily memory, and that we access that. The ability to dance is often a skill that's developed by repetitive movements of the body over and over and over again. No one learns to dance by reading a book. Just like nobody learns mathematics by reading a book. They've got to do the exercises too.
Yeah.
Right. Nobody learns the Dhamma without also developing the skills that it takes to be able to see this stuff. But I'm giving you an overall general introduction. And so with these kind of Sankaras, one is the body, the next one, which is actually mostly mental, and it's in the middle part of the brain. This is the language. This is where we become not just reptiles, but now we've got the the mammal brain, the brain that the dogs and the monkeys and the horses and the sheep and all of that have. And if you'll recognize, they have language. This is where we store our language. Our language is a little more sophisticated than theirs, but sometimes not very much.
Mm.
Sometimes they get really sophisticated. So, in that, we have all of our language, we have all of our vocabulary, and we also have all of our ways of putting that language and vocabulary together in an arrangement that we call knowledge or understanding. Okay? Now, let's go to the third kind, because the third kind is the kind that's really the problem. And that is the emotional sankara. Then we've been piling on memories since little childhood, even though the actual visual memories are no longer there, the emotional or the feeling parts of it are there. That this stuff is stored actually in the cerebellum, in the back part of the brain. This is why people will have, depends upon where they get hit in the back part of the brain. They can either go blind if they're hit in the upper part, but in the lower part, in the cerebellum, that's what will cause amnesia.
1 second. Let me get a charger for my computer. All right. Continue.
And that's funny because people who have amnesia don't know who they are, don't know their past, don't know how to feel things, don't recognize people, etc., and yet they can perfectly speak well the English language. Why don't they forget that too? All right? Why? Because the English language part is stored in a different part of the brain. That's why people with amnesia have a particular issue because they've gotten hit in the back part of the head. That's where the cerebellum is. We also know that the cerebellum has more neurons density. The neurons are more dense in the cerebellum than any place else in the brain. So there's a lot of stuff that's stored there. This is our, as it were, this is our hard drive.
Mm.
And that things are stored with various references, but one of the primary references that things are stored here is with emotions or feelings. But in fact, in the Pali, the word is Sita Sankara, and that in the English language they translate it as mental Sankara, but in the Thai language, and when I learned in Thai from Bhikkhu Buddhadasa, in the Thai language, this is translated as jai, which means heart, which means emotion, that this really is the emotion. Which what that means is that we remember how to feel. And so Republicans will hear a particular word and they feel the way that a Republican would feel because it's stored that way.
Yeah.
And they'll continue to feel that way every time that topic comes up. And one word that you can come up would be Buddhist or atheist or non-Christian or any word like that. And for one whole group of people, you're going to get one kind of reaction. And mostly that's because those people have kept that reaction from childhood, to where another group of people will have a different reaction because they've inspected their reactions. They recognize that it's not correct and that they've decided to change their mind about it.
Yeah.
All right, so that's basically what we've got to do with the teachings of the Buddha, big time, because we're going to take apart everything. And so I wanted to introduce this concept of the Sankara to you, so that you can recognize that almost everything that we think about is clouded with our memories and our way of feeling, so that we're almost destined to feel a particular way about a particular thing because we've got it stored that way.
Mm.
But if we can change that storage, if we can be mindful when that stuff comes up to say, wait a minute, I don't have to feel that way. I can feel another way.
Mm.
And now we're beginning to lay a new foundation, a new set of sankaras, so that the old ones will rot away and the new ones, more wholesome and beneficial, will take a hold and will go on to the new automatic pilot.
Yeah.
But we've got more to learn than that, but I thought that I would introduce that part to you so that you can understand really why we're working together is not to teach meditation, but rather is to get the mind with meditation fit for work, and that the work then has to be done basically 24 hours a day.
Yeah.
Getting the mind fit for work and then putting it to work so that it's at work, happily at work, all the time. That would be a good working definition of enlightenment, is to have the lights on all the time.
Yeah.
But we're not going to get it that way by building up to it. A lot of people think, oh, then to turn the light on means that I have to start and very slowly and with great difficulty turn a rheostat just a little bit so that I get just a little bit more brightness and just a little bit more brightness and someday I'll get it turned on, right? That's the way that a lot of people think. Think about it like this. Think about it that it's a spring-loaded switch. And all you have to do is to throw that switch, and when you let your finger off, it's going to go back to normal.
Mm.
So all you have to do is just keep your finger on the switch all the time and you can see just fine. But it is spring loaded for a while. Eventually, by having it on all the time, that swing gets really weak and it's really easy to hold it up.
Mm.
And eventually, the spring will lose all of its springiness, and then the switch will just stay up there naturally. And so that's a different way of looking at it. The one way is looking at it with the rheostat, is seeing things off into the future. Someday, I'll be able to see what's going on. I'll be able to get the lights on. But this new way of looking at it is, oh no, be here now. Be here now. Be here now. Over and over and over again. Come to the here now. Be here now. Forget the past. Come and be here now. Forget the future. Come and be here now. Forget the feelings that you're having. Inspect them closely and then choose what feelings you want to have. Right here, right now. So everything has to do with being here now in this present moment. Because that's when the frontal cortex is actually alive and alert. That when we're thinking about the past or when we're on automatic pilot, that means that the reptilian brain is in charge, is doing all the work. We're on automatic pilot. Now, that reptilian brain.
I've got a little kitten walking around.
Uh-huh. Yes, I could tell by the markings that it was a cat.
Yeah.
Though I didn't. So,
she's just interested in the teaching of the Dharma.
Well, he's actually interested in whatever you're interested in. This is jealousy, which is something that we have to begin to see in ourselves. And we'll eventually talk about that. In this moment, what we were talking about was feelings. That we have to start to learn with to manage our feelings. Here's the thing that's very interesting. You can go around and ask anybody this question. It might be worth your own personal survey. And the question would be, for each individual person, would be, if you had a choice about how you were going to feel, how would you feel? Almost everybody would say something like, I would feel happy, I would feel joyful, I would be blissed, etc., like that. How would you feel if you could
Mm.
feel the way you wanted to feel? Why is it then that people don't feel the way that they want to feel? Well, there's an answer to that. And the answer is that people feel the way they expect to feel.
Mm.
They don't feel the way they want to feel, they feel the way they expect to feel. Now, how do people expect to feel? They expect to feel the way that they have been feeling in the past. In other words, they're going by habit. But when you recognize that, oh, I only feel the way I expect to feel because of habit, I can change that habit. I can intentionally to raise my expectations in this moment so that I can be happy right now. And you can do that every time you think of it.
Mm.
That's sati. That's
Yeah.
why we want to develop this skill of sati, is to remember and then to take the right effort that it takes to feel the way we want to feel, as opposed to feeling the way that we were feeling a moment ago based upon the expectations of a hindered mind. Now that the mind is free from hindrance, let's have that pleasure of being free from hindrances, free from our own expectations, in fact, so that we can feel the way that we want to feel. One of the ways that I talk to the students about it is in the sense of the pleasure of seeing that the mind has wandered away from the breath is, aha, I caught you. I can see you. Right? Why? Because the other possibility is to continue with the feelings that we have expected to feel, which are generally not joyful at all. We're not, in fact, taking that water and dripping and drilling onto that sheet of bath powder or baking flour. And because we're not doing it, the mind still stays dry, powdery, subject to the wind, and not very delicious either.
Yeah.
Or in the case of soap, not very useful.
Yeah.
So we want to continue to add this joy, to add that success, the ability to see the mind wandering away and bringing joy. That's step number 10 of Anapanasati. It is by definition part of first jhana. Now, a lot of students say, oh, the way that it's worded in the sutta means that if I am free from the hindrance, then uh, the joy is automatically there. But it's not going to be automatic if our my expectations are is I'm going to be free from hindrance and I'm still going to feel the way that I used to feel. But if we say, oh no, I can see the hindrances, I know what's going on now, let's throw the hindrances out and let's replace it with joy. Let's replace it with be here now. Let's
Mm.
replace it with this present moment and the success of being here now. Ah, now we're beginning to put the first jhana together. We've actually got to do this so that we take the joy and pleasure of having a mind free from hindrances. Take the satisfaction of having a mind that's fit for work, that we can apply it, put it where we want it, and keep it there. This is a mental state to be developed, this first jhana. And we do that by coming back over and over and over again. And when we come back, it's only a hop, skip, and a jump in the mind. So let's hop, let's skip, and let's jump. Finally, I get a smile out of you.
Yeah.
Yes, that's the way that meditation is to be practiced
Mm,
when it's practiced correctly, is that it's a joyful thing, something that you like to sit down to do.
yeah.
Not that it's a duty that's going to give you a reward later, but something that's really fun and enjoyable to do right here, right now,
Yeah.
over and over and over again to get into that state of being enlightened and get into the habit of being in the state of being enlightened as opposed to wanting something that you don't have. And what is that? Wanting enlightenment that you don't have is suffering. That
Mm,
is not enlightenment, it's suffering. So we have to come out of the desire, coming out of the want, and start developing being satisfied and happy with the practice so that we can get the mind into that state that makes it fit for work so that we can really dig deep. Because believe me, when you're digging down in there, you're going to find some shit you do not like to touch, you do not like to smell,
mm,
you do not like what's going on. And by doing that, then we can put it back in there and say, okay, I'm not going to go into that anymore. I'm going to bury that one.
mm.
That's the way to go. But we're going to have to do some digging around for a little while, and you're going to run across some stuff about yourself you don't like. Congratulations. No longer are you deluded.
Yeah.
But the question is, are you going to still keep digging? Because a lot of people, they start digging, they don't like what they see, they want to stop digging. So we've covered today the rationale behind meditation. And in that regard, I would not call myself a meditation teacher. I would teach. I would call it a Dhamma teacher, and I use the word Dhamma like a music teacher would say. I'm a music teacher. I do not teach chords and scales. Meditation is chords and
Mm-hmm.
scales. It's not music. It's just chords and scales. So once you learn the chords and scales, we can start making some music together. And that is the real Dhamma. But we have to get the mind fit for work first. You have to get it to become joyful.
Mm,
I do not know why so many of the teachers miss out on that, and it may be because they all do, but they cover it in the order that is normally covered from the time of the Buddha. And because of that, the students never get to the part of the book that says, read this, do this first. On one of my books here, it's on page 213. That's right. This is Bhikkhu Buddha's Dasa's book on Anapanasati Bhavana. And I think it's on, let me see if I can quickly find it here. Um, I'll read this part of it. This is one of the things that I found, though it's not exactly what I was looking for. Um, with each inhalation and exhalation, let there be delightfulness of the mind. Delightfulness is something which everyone wishes to have. It is like uh, good bodily feelings, pity, a sort of joy or contentment. To be delighted is to be satisfied, cheerful, contented, or whatever you may wish to call it. Everyone likes a delightful mind and not a weary or disparaging one. Um, but not everyone can have it because many people simply do not have the power over their mind. Sometimes the mind is being concocted and manipulated by various factors till it becomes depressed and weary. Therefore, there is a need to train the mind and fill it with delightfulness from the very beginning. Delightfulness of the mind holds some value for both the worldly and spiritual aspects of life. From the worldly aspect, it is needless to say that all of us generally yearn for a delightfulness, a life of delightfulness. But in the spiritual aspect, delightfulness has a special purpose of its own. It is only a delightful mind that can be a factor for the building up of a higher level of samadhi. Until insight and wisdom emerge, to attain that level of insight requires a mind that has gone through a paramount or delight, which is then restrained by calmness. People in general do not know that for insight to appear, the mind needs to have this joy and delight as its capital. If the mind experiences this kind of delight and also sukha or happiness, there is a hope that it will generate samadhi and a true knowledge of what things really are in accordance with real facts to be attained. And now I'm all the way over on page 217. And yet, that's the first thing that needs to be said.
Yeah.
I think also that that's true in Chuladas's book, that he covers this stuff in great detail in chapter 10.
Mm.
And most of the students don't ever get over to chapter 10.
Mm. Yeah, I remember he uses specifically the same, he uses the phrase, I think, to appreciate the aha moment. And so that's, but yeah, and I've noticed in my own sits that there's kind of when I defuse from a thought, I defuse from it, I let go of the thought, and I get this kind of wave of pleasant energy.
Mm-hmm.
And then I remember to do the exaggerated congratulation. And
Yes.
I do that, and I get a second wave of pleasant energy. And
yes.
so it's, yeah.
That's good. That's exactly the way that we want to continue to practice. Excellent. Continue to practice just that way, over and over and over again, so that you get more and more hits of that joy.
Yeah.
That we're going to have to do a lot of sprinkling to get the mind all unified together into a ball of dough.
And how do I guess, know I'm, I guess, sufficiently unified?
That's a question that an ununified mind will ask.
Okay. It will be clear.
The mind, there's something quite marvelous about the Dhamma itself and the mind, that as we begin to take the Dhamma apart, we begin to take the mind apart, and as we reassemble the Dhamma so that we get it together, we also reassemble the mind. And so I'm talking about assembling and disassembling. Imagine that it's like a jigsaw puzzle. And here I am, every time you call me, delivering you another full handful of puzzles of the jigsaw puzzle. And you're beginning to actually figure out what the overall thing is looking like, but you still haven't quite figured out how to put all of the pieces together. And that question comes from that. Once you really get into the flow and you've got 2/3 of this puzzle put together, all you're asking for now is more pieces, more pieces. Because I know how to put this thing together now. Okay, so that once you figure that out, how to put this thing together, then that's when we start looking at some of these extra detailed pieces that, let us say, from, you probably know the word, the stuff that the anagami has to deal with.
Mm.
Hmm. Right now, we're still learning how to deal with feelings.
Yeah.
All right, so let's continue on with this, and that we'll look next time in more and more of the structure itself.
Okay, cool.
Excellent. Do you have any more questions?
No, I am running close to the end of how much time I have.
Me too. All righty. So we'll see you.
Bye-bye.
Bye bye. Have a good chuckle.